you can have this kind of intuition that our civilization, you said culture, but you really mean the spirit of the civilization, the entirety of the civilization may not exist for long.
Yeah. So,
What's your, can you untangle that? What's your intuition behind that? So you kind of offline mentioned to me that the Industrial Revolution was kind of the moment we agreed to accept the offer, sign on the paper on the dotted line with the Industrial Revolution, we doomed ourselves. Can you elaborate on that?
this is suspicion. I, of course, don't know how it plays out, but
Of course.
It seems to me that in a society in which you leverage yourself very far over an entropic abyss without land on the other side, it's relatively clear that your cantilever is at some point going to break down into this entropic abyss, and you have to pay the bill.
Okay, Russia's my first language, and I'm also an idiot.
Me too.
This is just two apes instead of playing with the banana, trying to have fun by talking. Okay, anthropic what? And what's anthropic?
Entropic. So entropic in the sense of entropy.
Entropic. Got it.
Yes. So this
and entropic. What was the other word you used?
Abyss.
What's that?
It's a big gorge.
Abyss.
Abyss, yes.
Entropic abyss. So many of the things you say are poetic. It's
and also
breaking my brain.
It's amazing, right?
It's mispronounced, which makes it even more poetic. Because Wittgenstein would be proud. So entropic abyss. Okay, let's rewind then. The Industrial Revolution. So how does that get us into the entropic abyss?
So in some sense, we burned 100 million years worth of trees to get everybody plumbing.
Yes.
And the society that we had before that had a very limited number of people. So basically since 0 BC, we hovered between 300 and 400 million people.
Yes.
And this only changed with the Enlightenment and the subsequent Industrial Revolution. And in some sense, the Enlightenment freed our rationality and also freed our norms from the pre-existing order gradually. And it was a process that basically happened in feedback loops, so it was not that just one caused the other. It was a dynamic that started. And the dynamic worked by basically increasing productivity to such a degree that we could feed all our children.
Yep.
And I think the definition of poverty is that you have as many children as you can feed before they die, which is in some sense the state that all animals on Earth are in.
The definition of poverty is having enough.
So you can have only so many children as you can feed, and if you have more, they die.
Yes.
And in our societies, you can basically have as many children as you want, and they don't die.
Right.
So the reason why we don't have as many children as we want is because we also have to pay a price in terms of we have to insert ourselves in the lower social stratum if we have too many. So basically everybody in the under, middle, and lower upper class has only a limited number of children, because having more of them would mean a big economic hit to the individual families.
Yes.
Because children, especially in the US, super expensive to have. And you only are taken out of this if you are basically super rich or if you are super poor. If you're super poor, it doesn't matter how many kids you have because your status is not going to change. And these children are largely not going to die of hunger.
So how does this lead us to self-destruction? So there's a lot of unpleasant properties about this process.
So basically what we try to do is we try to let our children survive, even if they have diseases.
Yes.
Like I would have died before my mid-20s without modern medicine, and most of my friends would have as well. And so many of us wouldn't live without the advantages of modern medicine and modern industrialized society. We get our protein largely by subduing the entirety of nature. Imagine there would be some very clever microbe that would live in our organisms and would completely harvest them and change them into a thing that is necessary to sustain itself. And it would discover that, for instance, brain cells are kind of edible, but they're not quite nice. So you need to have more fat in them, and you turn them into more fat cells.
Yes.
And basically this big organism would become a vegetable that is barely alive, and it's going to be very brittle and not resilient when the environment changes.
Yeah, but the some part of that organism, the one that's actually doing all the using of there'll still be somebody thriving.
So it relates back to this original question. I suspect that we are not the smartest thing on this planet. I suspect that basically every complex system has to have some complex regulation if it depends on feedback loops. And so, for instance, it's likely that we should ascribe a certain degree of intelligence to plants. The problem is that plants don't have a nervous system. So they don't have a way to telegraph messages over large distances almost instantly in the plant. And instead, they will rely on chemicals between adjacent cells, which means the signal processing speed depends on the signal processing with a rate of a few millimeters per second.
Yes.
And as a result, if the plant is intelligent, it's not going to be intelligent at similar timescales as us.
Yeah, the brilliant put. So the time scale is different. So you suspect we might not be the most intelligent, but we're the most intelligent in this
At our
spatial
time
scale
scale, yes.
and our time scale.
So basically, if you would zoom out very far, we might discover that there have been intelligent ecosystems on the planet that existed for thousands of years in an almost undisturbed state. And it could be that these ecosystems actively relate to their environment. So basically change the course of the evolution within this ecosystem to make it more efficient and less brittle.
So it's possible something like plants is actually a set of living organisms, an ecosystem of living organisms that are just operating at a different time scale and are far superior in intelligence than human beings. And then human beings will die out and plants will still be there and they'll be there.
Yeah, there's an evolutionary adaptation playing a role at all of these levels. For instance, if mice don't get enough food and get stressed, the next generation of mice will be more sparse and more scrawny. And the reason for this is because in the natural environment, the mice have probably hit a drought or something else. And if they overgraze, then all the things that sustain them might go extinct. And there will be no mice a few generations from now. So to make sure that there will be mice in 5 generations from now, basically the mice scale back. And a similar thing happens with the predators of mice. They should make sure that the mice don't completely go extinct.
Yeah.
So in some sense, if the predators are smart enough, they will be tasked with shepherding their food supply.
Right.
And maybe the reason why lions have much larger brains than antelopes is not so much because it's so hard to catch an antelope as opposed to run away from the lion, but the lions need to make complex models of their environment, more complex than the antelopes.
So first of all, just describing that there's a bunch of complex systems and human beings may not even be the most special or intelligent of those complex systems, even on Earth, makes me feel a little better about the extinction of human species that we're talking about.
Yes, maybe we are just Gaia's ploy to put the carbon back into the atmosphere.
Yeah, this is just a nice, we tried it out.
The big stain on evolution is not us, it was trees. Earth evolved trees before they could be digested again, right? There were no insects that could break all of them apart. Cellulose is so robust that you cannot get all of it with microorganisms. So many of these trees fell into swamps. And all this carbon became inert and could no longer be recycled into organisms. And we are the species that is destined to take care of that.
So there's this kind of...
dig it out of the ground, put it back into the atmosphere, and the Earth is already greening.
Yeah.
So within a million years or so, when the ecosystems have recovered from the rapid changes that they're not compatible with right now, the Earth is going to be awesome again.
And there won't be even a memory of us little apes.
I think there will be memories of us. I suspect we are the first generally intelligent species in this sense. We are the first species with an industrial society because we will leave more phones than bones in the stratosphere.
Well, see, phones than bones. I like it. But then let me push back. You've kind of suggested that we have a very narrow definition of intelligence. I mean, why aren't trees more general, a higher level of general intelligence?
Well, if trees were intelligent, then they would be at different timescales, which means within 100 years, the tree is probably not going to make models that are as complex as the ones that we make in 10 years.
But maybe the trees are the ones that made the phones, right? Like
well, you could say the entirety of life did it. You know, the first cell never died. The first cell only split, right? And divided. And every cell in our body is still an instance of the first cell that split off from that very first cell. There was only one cell on this planet as far as we know.
Yeah.
And so the cell is not just a building block of life. It's a hyperorganism, right? And we are part of this hyperorganism.
So, nevertheless, this hyperorganism, this little particular branch of it, which is us humans, because of the Industrial Revolution and maybe the exponential growth of technology, might somehow destroy ourselves. So, what what do you think is the most likely way we might destroy ourselves? So some people worry about genetic manipulation. Some people, as we've talked about, worry about either dumb artificial intelligence or super intelligent artificial intelligence destroying us. Some people worry about nuclear weapons and weapons of war in general. What do you think? If you were a betting man, what would you bet on in terms of self-destruction? And it would be higher than 50, would it be higher than 50%?
So it's very likely that nothing that we bet on matters
Yeah.
after we win our bets. So I don't think that bets are literally the right thing, way to go about this.
I mean, once you're dead, it doesn't. You won't be there to collect the winnings.
It's also not clear if we, as a species, go extinct. Right. But I think that our present civilization is not sustainable. So the thing that will change is there will be probably fewer people on the planet than are today. And even if not, then still most of people that are alive today will not have offspring in 100 years from now because of the geographic changes and so on and the changes in the food supply. It's quite likely that many areas of the planet will only be livable with a close cooling chain in 100 years from now. So many of the areas around the equator and in subtropical climates that are now quite pleasant to live in will stop to be inhabitable without air conditioning.
Chain. So you honestly, wow, cooling chain, close-knit cooling chain communities. So you think you have a strong worry about the effects of global warming that we
by itself, it's not a big issue. If you live in Arizona right now, you have basically 3 months in the summer in which you cannot be outside.
Yes.
And so you have a closed cooling chain. You have air conditioning in your car and in your home, and you're fine. And if the air conditioning would stop for a few days, then in many areas you would not be able to survive. Right?
Can we just pause for a second? Like, you say so many brilliant poetic things. Like, what is a closed? Do people use that term, closed cooling chain?
I imagine that people use it when they describe how they get meat into a supermarket, right? If you break the cooling chain and this thing starts to thaw, you're in trouble and you have to throw it away. Well, and a similar thing in a way happens to us.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. It's like calling a city a closed social chain or something like that. I mean, that's right. I mean, the locality of it is really important.
Yeah, but it basically means you wake up in a climatized room, you go to work in a climatized car, you work in a climatized office, you shop in a climatized supermarket, and in between you have very short distance in which you run from your car to the supermarket, but you have to make sure that your temperature does not approach the temperature of the environment.
Yeah. So
and the crucial thing is the wet bulb temperature.
The what?
The wet bulb temperature. It's what you get when you take a wet cloth and you put it around your thermometer, and then you move it very quickly through the air. So you get the evaporation heat.
Yes.
And as soon as you can no longer cool your body temperature via evaporation to a temperature below something like, I think, 35 degrees, you die.
Right.
And which means if the outside world is dry, you can still cool yourself down by sweating. But if it has a certain degree of humidity or if it goes over a certain temperature, then sweating will not save you. And this means even if you're a healthy, fit individual within a few hours, even if you try to be in the shade and so on, you'll die. Unless you have some climatizing equipment. And this itself, as long as you maintain civilization and you have energy supply and you have food trucks coming to your home that are climatized, everything is fine. But what if you lose large-scale open agriculture at the same time? So basically you run into food insecurity because climate becomes very irregular or weather becomes very irregular and you have a lot of extreme weather events. So you need to grow most of your food maybe indoor, or you need to import your food from certain regions. And maybe you're not able to maintain the civilization throughout the planet to get the infrastructure to get the food to your home.
Right. But there could be significant impacts in the sense that people begin to suffer. There could be wars over resources and so on. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, do you not have not a faith, but what do you make of the capacity of technological innovation to help us prevent some of the worst damages that this condition can create? So, as an example, as a almost out there example, is the work that SpaceX and Elon Musk is doing of trying to also consider our propagation throughout the universe in deep space to colonize other planets. Mm-hmm. That's one technological step.
But of course, what Elon Musk is trying on Mars is not to save us from global warming, because Mars looks much worse than Earth will look like after the worst outcomes of global warming imaginable, right?
Yeah, yes, but
Mars is essentially not habitable.
it's
And
exceptionally harsh environment. Yes, but what he is doing, what a lot of people throughout history since the Industrial Revolution are doing, are just doing a lot of different technological innovation with some kind of target, and what ends up happening is totally unexpected new things come up.
mhm.
So, trying to terraform or trying to colonize Mars, an extremely harsh environment, might give us totally new ideas of how to expand or increase the power of this closed cooling circuit that empowers the community. So, like, do you? It seems like there's a little bit of a race between our open-ended technological innovation of this uh, communal operating system that we have, and our general tendency to want to overuse resources and thereby destroy ourselves. You don't think technology can win that race?
I think the probability is relatively low, given that our technology is, for instance, the US is stagnating since the 1970s, roughly, in terms of technology. Most of the things that we do are the result of incremental processes.
What about Intel? What about Moore's law?
It's basically it's very incremental. The things that we are
Yeah.
doing
Oh,
is so after the invention of the microprocessor was a major thing, right? The miniaturization of transistors was really major, but the things that we did afterwards largely were not that innovative. So
well,
we
hold on a
had gradual
second.
changes of uh, scaling things into from GPUs into from CPUs into GPUs and things like that. But I don't think that there are basically there are not many things. If you take a person that died in the 70s and was at the top of their game, they would not need to read that many books to be current again.
But it's all about books. Who cares about books? So there might be things that are beyond books. Might be a
Or say
very
papers or
no papers. Forget papers. There might be things that are so papers and books and knowledge. That's a concept of a time when you were sitting there by candlelight and individual consumers of knowledge.
Mhm.
What about the impact that we're not in the middle of? Might not be understanding of Twitter, of YouTube. The reason you and I are sitting here today is because of Twitter and YouTube.
Yes.
So the ripple effect, and there's two minds, sort of two dumb apes, are coming up with perhaps a new clean insights, and there's 200 other apes listening right now, 200,000 other apes listening right now, and that effect. It's very difficult to understand what that effect will have. That might be bigger than any of the advancements of the microprocessor or the Industrial Revolution. The ability of spread knowledge, and that knowledge, the like, it allows good ideas to reach millions much faster. And the effect of that might be that might be the 21st century, is the multiplying of ideas, of good ideas. Because if you say one good thing today, that will multiply across, huge amounts of people. And then they will say something, and then they will have another podcast, and they'll say something, and then they'll write a paper. That could be a huge. You don't think that?
Yeah, we should have billions von Neumanns right now, of von Neumanns right now in Turing's, and we don't for some reason. I suspect the reason is that we destroy our attention span. Also, the incentives are, of course, different.
Yeah,
but
Kim Kardashians, yeah.
So the reason why we are sitting here and doing this as a YouTube video is because you and me don't have the attention span to write a book together right now, and you guys probably don't have the attention span to read it. So let me tell you,
but I guarantee you, they're still listening.
Bursts take care of your attention. It's very short.
But we're an hour and 40 minutes in, and I guarantee you that 80% of the people are still listening. So there is an attention span. It's just the form. Who said that the book is the optimal way to transfer information? That's still an open question. So I mean, that's what we're.
There's something that social media could be doing that other forms could not be doing. I think the end game of social media is a global brain. And Twitter is, in some sense, a global brain that is completely hooked on dopamine, doesn't have any kind of inhibition, and as a result is caught in a permanent seizure.
Yes.
It's also, in some sense, a multiplayer role-playing game. And people use it to play an avatar that is not like them as they were in the sane world. And they look through the world through the lens of their phones and think it's the real world. But it's the Twitter world that is distorted by the popularity incentives of Twitter.
Yeah, the incentives and just our natural biological, the dopamine rush of a like, no matter how, like, I try to be very kind of Zen-like and minimalist and not be influenced by likes and so on. But it's probably very difficult to avoid that to some degree. Speaking at a small tangent of Twitter, what how can Twitter be done better? I think it's an incredible mechanism that has a huge impact on society by doing exactly what you're doing. Doing exactly what you described, which is having this. We're like is some kind of game, and we're kind of our individual RL agents in this game, and it's uncontrollable because there's not really a centralized control. Neither Jack Dorsey nor the engineers at Twitter seem to be able to control this game, or can they? That's sort of a question. Is there any advice you would give on
So
how
I
to
wouldn't
control
give
this game?
advice because I am certainly not an expert, but I can give my thoughts on this. And
Yes.
our brain has solved this problem to some degree, right? Our brain
Right.
has lots of individual agents that manage to play together in a way. And they have also many contexts in which other organisms have found ways to solve the problems of cooperation that we don't solve on Twitter. And maybe the solution is to go for an evolutionary approach. So imagine that you have something like Reddit or something like Facebook and something like Twitter, and you think about what they have in common. What they have in common, they're companies that in some sense own a protocol. And this protocol is imposed on a community. And the protocol has different components for monetization, for user management, for user display, for rating, for anonymity, for import of other content, and so on. And now imagine that you take these components of the protocol apart and you do it in some sense like communities within this social network. And these communities are allowed to mix and match their protocols and design new ones. So for instance, the UI and the UX can be defined by the community. The rules for sharing content across communities can be defined. The monetization can be redefined. The way you reward individual users for what can be redefined. The way users can represent themselves and to each other can be redefined.
But
And
who could be the redefiner? So, like, can individual human beings build enough intuition to redefine those things?
this itself can become part of the protocol. So, for instance, it could be in some communities, it will be a single person that comes up with these things. In others, it's a group of friends. Some might implement a voting scheme that has some interesting weighted voting. Who knows?
Right.
Who knows what will be the best self-organizing principle for this?
But the process can't be automated. I mean, it seems like the brain
It can be automated, so people can write software for this. And eventually the idea is, let's not make an assumption about this thing if we don't know what the right solution is. In those areas where we have no idea whether the right solution will be people designing this ad hoc or machines doing this, whether you want to enforce compliance by social norms like Wikipedia or with software solutions or with AI that goes through the posts of people or with a legal principle and so on. This is something maybe you need to find out. And so the idea would be if you let the communities evolve and you just control it in such a way that you are incentivizing the most sentient communities, the ones that produce the most interesting behaviors and that allow you to interact in the most helpful ways to the individuals, right? So you have a network that gives you information that is relevant to you. It helps you to maintain relationships to others in healthy ways. Yeah. It allows you to build teams. It allows you to basically bring the best of you into this thing and goes into a coupling, into a relationship with others in which you produce things that you would be unable to produce alone.
Yes, beautifully put. So, but the key process of that with incentives and evolution is things that don't adopt themselves to effectively get the incentives have to die. And the thing about social media is communities that are unhealthy or whatever you want to define as the incentives really don't like dying. One of the things that people really get protest aggressively is when they're censored. Especially in America. I don't know much about the rest of the world, but the idea of freedom of speech, the idea of censorship is really painful in America. And so what do you think about that, having grown up in East Germany? What do you think censorship is an important tool in our brain, in the intelligence, and in the social networks? So basically, if you're not a good member of the entirety of the system, you should be locked away, blocked.
Important thing is who decides that you're a good member.
Who is it distributed or?
And what is the outcome of the process that decides it, both for the individual and for society at large? For instance, if you have a high trust society, you don't need a lot of surveillance. And the surveillance is even, in some sense, undermining trust.
Yes.
Because it's basically punishing people that look suspicious when surveyed, but do the right thing anyway. And the opposite, if you have a low trust society, then surveillance can be a better trade-off. And the US is currently making a transition from a relatively high trust or mixed trust society to a low trust society. So surveillance will increase. Another thing is that beliefs are not just inert representations. There are implementations that run code on your brain and change your reality and change the way you interact with each other at some level. And some of the beliefs are just public opinions that we use to display our alignment. So, for instance, people might say all cultures are the same and equally good, but still they prefer to live in some cultures over others, very, very strongly so. And it turns out that the cultures are defined by certain rules of interaction. And these rules of interaction lead to different results when you implement them, right? So if you adhere to certain rules, you get different outcomes in different societies. And this all leads to very tricky situations when people do not have a commitment to shared purpose. And our societies probably need to rediscover what it means to have a shared purpose and how to make this compatible with a non-totalitarian view. So in some sense, the US is caught in a conundrum between totalitarianism and diversity, and doesn't need to how to resolve this. And the solutions that the US has found so far are very crude because it's a very young society that is also under a lot of tension. So it seems to me that the US will have to reinvent itself.
What do you think? Just philosophizing, what kind of mechanisms of government do you think we as a species should be evolving with, US or broadly? What do you think will work well as a system? Of course, we don't know. It all seems to work pretty crappily. Some things worse than others. Some people argue that communism is the best. Others say, yeah, look at the Soviet Union. Some people argue that anarchy is the best, and then completely discarding the positive effects of government. You know, there's a lot of arguments. U.S. seems to be doing pretty damn well in the span of history. There's respect for human rights, which seems to be a nice feature, not a bug. And economically, a lot of growth, a lot of technological development. People seem to be relatively kind on the grand scheme of things. Mm-hmm. What lessons do you draw from that? What kind of government system do you think is good?
Ideally, government should not be perceivable, right? It should be frictionless. The more you notice the influence of the government, the more friction you experience, the less effective and efficient the government probably is, right? Mm. So a government, game theoretically, is an agent that imposes an offset on your payout metrics to make your Nash equilibrium compatible with the common good. Right, so you have these situations where people act on their local incentives.
Yeah.
And these local incentives, everybody does the thing that's locally the best for them, but the global outcome is not good. And this is even the case when people care about the global outcome, because a regulation mechanisms exist that creates a causal relationship between what I want to have for the global good and what I do. So for instance, if I think that we should fly less and I stay at home, there's not a single plane that is going to not start because of me, right? It's not going to have an influence, but I don't get from A to B. So the way to implement this would basically to have a government that is sharing this idea that we should fly less and is then imposing a regulation that, for instance, makes flying more expensive and it gives incentives for inventing other forms of transportation that are less putting that strain on the environment, for instance.
So there's so much optimism and so many things you describe, and yet there's the pessimism of you think our civilization is going to come to an end. So that's not 100% probability. Nothing in this world is. So what's the trajectory out of self-destruction, do you think?
I suspect that in some sense we are both too smart and not smart enough, which means we are very good at solving near-term problems, and at the same time we are unwilling to submit to the imperatives of that we would have to follow in if we want to stick around.
Right.
So that makes it difficult. If you were unable to solve everything technologically, you can probably understand how high the child mortality needs to be to absorb the mutation rate, and how high the mutation rate needs to be to adapt to a slowly changing ecosystemic environment, right? So you could, in principle, compute all these things game theoretically and adapt to it. But if you cannot do this because you are like me and you have children, you don't want them to die, you will use any kind of medical information to keep child mortality low, even if it means that within a few generations we have enormous genetic drift, and most of us have allergies as a result of not being adapted to the changes that we made to our food supply.
That's for now. I say technologically speaking, we're just very young. 300 years industrial revolution. We're very new to this idea. So you're attached to your kids being alive and not being murdered for the greater good of society. But that might be a very temporary moment of time.
Yes,
that we might evolve in our thinking. So, like you said, we're both smart and not smart enough.
We are probably not this first human civilization that has discovered technology that allows to efficiently overgraze our resources. And this overgrazing is a thing. At some point, we think we can compensate this because if we have eaten all the grass, we will find a way to grow mushrooms. Right. But it could also be that the ecosystems tip. And so what really concerns me is not so much the end of the civilization, because we will invent a new one. But what concerns me is the fact that, for instance, the oceans might tip. So, for instance, maybe the plankton dies because of ocean acidification and cyanobacteria take over. And as a result, we can no longer breathe the atmosphere. This would be really concerning. So basically a major reboot of most complex organisms on Earth. And I think this is a possibility. I don't know if what the percentage for this possibility is, but it doesn't seem to be outlandish to me if you look at the scale of the changes that we've already triggered on this planet. And so Danny Hillis suggests that, for instance, we may be able to put chalk into the stratosphere to limit solar radiation. Maybe it works. Maybe this is sufficient to counter the effects of what we've done. Maybe it won't be. Maybe we won't be able to implement it by the time it's prevalent. I have no idea how the future is going to play out in this regard. It's just, I think it's quite likely that we cannot continue like this. All our cousin species, the other hominids, are gone.
So the right step would be to what? To rewind towards the Industrial Revolution and slow so try to contain the technological process that leads to the overconsumption of resources.
Imagine you get to choose. You have one lifetime.
Yes.
You get born into a sustainable agricultural civilization, 300, maybe 400 million people on the planet, tops. Or before this, some kind of nomadic species with like a million or 2 million.
Yeah.
And so you don't meet new people unless you give birth to them. You cannot travel to other places in the world. There is no internet. There is no interesting intellectual tradition that reaches considerably deep. So you would not discover Turing completeness probably, and so on.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't exist. And the alternative is you get born into an insane world. One that is doomed to die because it has just burned 100 million years worth of trees in a single century.
Which one do you like?
I think I like this one. It's a very weird thing that when you find yourself on a Titanic and you see this iceberg and it looks like we are not going to miss it. And a lot of people are in denial, and most of the counter arguments sound like denial to me. They don't seem to be rational arguments. And the other thing is we are born on this Titanic. Without this Titanic, we wouldn't have been born. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be talking. We wouldn't be on the internet. We wouldn't do all the things that we enjoy. And we are not responsible for this happening. It's basically, if we had the choice, we would probably try to prevent it. But when we were born, we were never asked when we want to be born, in which society we want to be born, what incentive structures we want to be exposed to. We have relatively little agency in the entire thing. Humanity has relatively little agency in the whole thing. It's basically a giant machine that's tumbling down a hill, and everybody is frantically trying to push some buttons. Nobody knows what these buttons are meaning, what they connect to. And most of them are not stopping this tumbling down the hill.
Is it possible that artificial intelligence will give us an escape latch somehow? So there's a lot of worry about existential threats of artificial intelligence. But what AI also allows, in general forms of automation, allows the potential of extreme productivity growth that will also, perhaps in a positive way, transform society, that may allow us to inadvertently to return to the more to the same kind of ideals of closer to nature that's represented in hunter-gatherer societies. That's not destroying the planet, that's not doing overconsumption and so on. I mean, generally speaking, do you have hope that AI can help somehow?
I think it is not fun to be very close to nature until you completely subdue nature. So our idea of being close to nature means being close to agriculture, basically forests that don't have anything in them that eats us.
See, I mean, I want to disagree with that. I think the niceness of being close to nature is to being fully present and in like when survival becomes your primary, not just your goal, but your whole existence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is I'm not just romanticizing. I can just speak for myself. I am self-aware enough that is a fulfilling existence.
I
That's
personally
one that's very
prefer to be in nature while and not fight for my survival. I think fighting in your for your survival while being in the cold and in the rain and being hunted by animals and having open wounds is very unpleasant.
well. There's a contradiction in there. Yes, I and you, just as you said, would not choose it. But if I was forced into it, it would be a fulfilling existence.
Yes, if you are adapted to it, basically, if your brain is wired up in such a way that you get rewards optimally in such an environment, and there's some evidence for this that for a certain degree of complexity, basically, people are more happy in such an environment because it's what we largely have evolved for. In between, we had a few thousand years in which I think we have evolved for a slightly more comfortable environment. So there is probably something like an intermediate stage in which people would be more happy than they would be if they would have to fend for themselves in small groups in the forest and often die, versus something like this where we now have basically a big machine, a big Mordor, in which we run through concrete boxes and press buttons in machines and largely don't feel well cared for as the monkeys that we are.